Alex here with a high conflict child custody video on motivations. I guess that's a good title for this one. Trying to understand your opponent's motivation is one of the keys to staying sane, especially when you perceive that they're doing things that are irrational, nonsensical, completely random. Um, I don't think this video is going to apply really well to people who have an ex that uses drugs or alcohol, other substances. And the reason why is because in those situations, you may actually get some pretty random behavior when they're sober versus the varying degrees of um, whatever particular substance they're on. And so you can still watch the video. It might be helpful for you in some ways, but just keep in mind this may not apply to you very well because those people can be pretty random depending on what state they're on in their addiction slash recovery cycle. So this video is for the rest of us, and specifically, yes, I will say that that my ex didn't, as far as I know, have any addictions with regards to substances. I think she was addicted to high conflict, and that's what I was about to say. Is let's go ahead and go into the sort of high conflict motive. And I talked about this in a few videos, but I get questions from viewers, and they're not bad questions, they're good questions. I get questions asking, you know, and I'm going to use the best example that I can, which is in my case, because you have the entire my docket series that you can watch to see my entire case from beginning to end. One of the questions that I got from a viewer was, why did your ex fight so hard when it came to the medical issues, the dentist specifically, and then later on just abandoned him? And I think the connection or the disconnect here was, this is an ex who was litigating pretty aggressively in my case, at least defending herself, and all of a sudden she just left. And the issue that they had was, if somebody loved their child so much to litigate, then why would they just leave in the end? And it is true that it does seem odd to some people because the termination of parental rights was uncontested. Here's what I have to say about that. The entire sort of approach that this particular viewer took was just not based on the right premise. She wasn't motivated by his best interests and his needs. She was motivated by something else. And that other thing was to keep the conflict going. And so if you are trying to understand why your ex, who says they love the child so much, is doing things that are harmful to the child, you might need to start looking at what they're doing through a different lens. Maybe, and I've talked about this before, so I'm not afraid to say it now, maybe they did not have the interests that of their child at heart. Maybe that wasn't their primary motivation. Maybe the primary motivation was to keep the conflict going. And if you start to look at all of the things your ex is doing, not through the lens of a frustrated person who's trying to do best for their kids but doesn't get it, and instead through the lens of a person who just wants conflict, you may find yourself, at least I did, in a situation where all of a sudden everything they're doing does make sense. It doesn't make sense to you. It doesn't make sense to the judge. It doesn't make sense to the lawyers. It doesn't make sense to your friends and family. It doesn't make sense maybe to even their friends and family, but it does make sense to them. What they're doing is not completely random to them. What they're doing is consistent through all of the years of litigation to them. And so, using the example that I mentioned, I said, our son needs dental care. He's got massive, issues, and he's going to need surgery. She could say, okay, I agree. And then the conflict would end because we would both agree he would get treatment. That would be the beginning and the end of it. Or she could say, I don't agree. He doesn't need it. And now litigation must ensue. The conflict continues. From the perspective of, let's do the thing that's best for the child, that doesn't make any sense. From the perspective of, let's keep the conflict going, that does make sense. You can see now why she couldn't just say, yes, I agree, let's, get his surgery done. Because if she did, that's the end of the conflict. It's over. So a lot of people struggle because they're like, well, who cares about the conflict? This is about the child. sorry to break it to you, they care about the conflict and it's not about the child. It's just not. And that is the lens that, if you, in fact, if you haven't seen the My Docket series and you start watching it as of today from part one, keep this in mind as you're watching, because then you'll be able to make sense of a lot of the things that my ex is doing, all the way from the beginning to the end. It'll all make sense. Now, one of the smoke screens that they throw up, and I hate to even use that word because it's like, it almost makes it seem like it's an advanced technique, but really I think it's fundamental. They know that they can't just go to a judge and say, I don't want my child to get his dental care because I like the conflict. That is so obvious to them. They can't go in and say that because they'll end up getting TPR'd probably. It's abbreviation for termination of parental rights. I mean, I don't know how. I would love to see a video of a parent being that candid to a judge. Yeah, Your Honor, I know that that's good for our son, but I don't care about what's good for our son. I really need this conflict to continue. Like, that video just doesn't exist. They have to come up with some kind of explanation, some kind of pretext for why they're doing what they're doing. They have to do this. And so, depending on the particular conflict that is before the court, they will find something plausible that makes it look like they aren't so bad, that makes it look like they're just confused and they don't get it, and or maybe they have a great argument and it's just that yours is better. They won't go into court and say, yeah, I don't care about my child, I care about conflict. And that is the reason why these cases are so confusing for so many people, because they're listening to what their ex is saying and they're not paying attention to what their ex is doing. And I think that some of the judges who are starting to figure this out, um, some of the judges who are starting to figure out how to navigate high conflict child custody cases, I feel like they must have finally figured this out. And those are the judges that I think are going to thrive on the bench when it comes to these cases. They're not going to just listen to what the litigant is saying. They're going to pay attention to what the litigant is doing. They're going to connect the dots and they're going to figure out what the parents' motivations are. Over time, you will see a pattern. And if you pay enough attention, you will notice it and you'll be able to take action as a judge. And hopefully, as the other party. Same thing with attorneys. The attorneys that just don't get this are going to be so frustrated and they're just going to go round and round in circles and not understand what's going on. They're just going to say parents are crazy and they're not going to really be able to solve these problems. But there are some attorneys who figured it out. Um, Another, I did kind of touch on this because I mentioned earlier in the video that the thing that the viewer brought to my attention was, your ex cared so much, they were in court, and then at the end, they left. That actually, believe it or not, is still consistent with what I said. If you look at the situation towards the end of the My Docket series, I had primary physical custody. I had sole legal custody. Her in person visitation rights were suspended, and she was not allowed to go to any more events. Think about this. If the physical custody is in my hands and supervised visits, or sorry, in-person visits are suspended, she has just lost the ability to inject conflict into an exchange because she can't even come and get him now. If she can't go to teachers' conferences, to doctor's appointments, to extracurriculars, if she's been literally banned by the judge from going to these things, that's another avenue of conflict that she's lost. What about decisions, Alex? Well, sole legal custody. Sole legal custody means I make all the decisions. She doesn't get to make any. She's just lost that piece of conflict. So when you go to the situation at the end of the case, she doesn't have any ability to create conflict anymore. It's over. She could try to file things, but maybe she had the perception that at that point in the case, with all of the litigation that we had done, there's nothing she could have done. There's no way she could have overcome that. One of the things that she had to do to overcome the it was the suspension of visitation was that she had to actually give her address. And that was one of the things that she loved to maintain throughout the entire case, is that she needed to stay in a secret location because I was a bad person. And so she was in a situation where the only decisions that she could make were not likely to create enough conflict, at least not to offset the embarrassment of being, crushed under the heel of the court. And at the same time, I was able to represent myself, whereas she tried it once and it didn't go well, and I think she didn't want to do that unless she had an attorney. And at that point in time, it's like, yes, she needs conflict, but there's other things that are pressing against that. And I think once she realized she couldn't do any, couldn't create any more conflict, the decision to allow the TPR to go through was the best decision she could make for herself. Um, there are other disputes in the case, like the school dispute. People ask about that a lot. You know, why did she want the child to go to an inferior school? And guys, if she agreed to put our child into the better school, the conflict would end. So you have to look at it from that perspective. She can agree and do something that's great for the child, but that ends the conflict. So she has to find some kind of reason not to. One of the best things about that dispute was that she didn't even file, or she didn't even provide what her intention was until she filed her opposition. That is so, so not normal. Most parents will respond in some way to an email, or our family with, they won't just stay completely silent and not say anything at all. And then you file a motion and then you finally find out what it is they want to do on opposition. Think about that for a second, guys. That's weird for a normal person who's trying to do what's best for their kids, but for a high conflict person, it's not. Now a motion's been filed and a hearing is pending. She ended up getting what she wanted, which wasn't a continuation of the conflict. The most extreme example of this is the midnight exchanges. This is one of the things that was so damaging to her case, and it was so difficult for her to show that she put the child first when it came to this issue. I wanted to end the midnight exchanges, and she didn't. That resulted, her resistance to ending the midnight exchanges resulted in 3 more motions. It was discussed at multiple hearings. So, from the perspective of what's best for the child, of course it doesn't make any sense. But as I mentioned earlier on in the video, that's not the motivation. The motivation is to continue the conflict. From that perspective, it actually makes a lot of sense. And if you think about it, she could have said, "You're right, this isn't good for our child to be woken up at midnight. Why don't we just move this to a different hour?" She could have said that. But if she said that, the conflict would have ended. It's the same when I was trying to alter the visitation. This is one of the biggest red flags. We had a timeshare situation, that was designed one way. And then when our child started school, I said, like most reasonable people would say, is let's just exchange the child at school. And most reasonable people want to do this because they already have to drive to the school anyway. If you were already going to the school, why would you want to leave the school and then drive to an exchange location to exchange the child? Normal people would say, "Hey, just pick him up from school." That's the obvious thing to do. And my ex opposed that. She wanted to keep the exchange at the time that it was, which would have required us to, not just me, but her too, to go to the school, pick up the child, and then like an hour later, go to the exchange point and exchange the child. That's more driving. That's a bigger waste of time. The reason that she didn't want to do that was because the exchange points, the exchange itself, was an opportunity to create conflict. If we just pick the child up and drop the child off from the school, we don't even see each other. That's a problem for her because it ends the conflict. So that's just yet another example to the viewers that if you look at this through the motivation of continuing a conflict, everything that your ex is doing actually does make sense to them. You will start to see that these things aren't so random, nonsensical, and insane as you think they are. To them, it makes perfect sense. To everybody else, it doesn't. And of course, like I mentioned earlier in the video, they're not going to go to court and say, "Yeah, Your Honor, I don't want to exchange at the school because I like having extra things to do, and that way I get to see him and harass him at an exchange." They're not going to say, "Yeah, Your Honor, I know it's bad for our child to be woken up at midnight, but I, this is one of the things that my ex wants to end, and if I allow that to end, then that's just one of the things that's going to end as far as conflict. They're not going to go into court and say that. They're going to come up with some excuse. I get off work at midnight, Your Honor. Most people would just be like, so what? Who cares if you get off work at midnight? Exchange the child during the daytime. But they have a plausible reason, even though it sounds terrible. And then with the school, I mean, there's always some kind of plausible reason that they're going to come up with. They're not going to go to court and say, I like conflict, please give me more. And so that, I think, is what confuses so many people, is they're paying so much attention to the reason, and they just need to stop. This is a person that's making decisions that are harmful to the child, therefore they should not have custody. Instead of trying to figure out why they're doing what they're doing and putting their interests ahead of the child, you should just put the child's interest first and think, you know what? Either they know what they're doing, in which case they're malevolent and they shouldn't have custody, or they don't know what they're doing, in which case they're incompetent and they shouldn't have custody. It doesn't really matter which one it is. There are probably other areas and other directions that this discussion could go, but I really wanted to keep it focused on the motivation of the ex and trying to get people to understand that they don't have the motivation you do. And so what they're doing might not make sense because it's not good for the children, but to them it does make sense because they're not aiming for what's good for the child. They're aiming for what's going to keep the conflict going. If you have any questions, feel free to post them down in the comments below, and I will see you guys next time.